G'day, Dave here. Yesterday I was having a conversation with a mate, and he was talking about the desire to know God, not just to know about God, but to really know God, to know Jesus, to be in a relationship that makes a difference, that feels something, that's intense, that's intimate, that's personal, that's real, that makes a difference in our lives. Maybe you know that longing as well, not just to know about God, not just to know knowledge and head knowledge and information about Jesus, but for that to transform and to shape us, for us to have a true experience of God. Well, if that's your desire, then you're in good company. Because the Apostle Paul expresses something like that in Philippians chapter 3. Let me read to you from verse 10. He says, I want to know Christ. See, he wants to know Christ. Now, he does know Christ. But he's saying, I want to know Christ. There's something important. There's something valuable. There's something right. This is the direction that he wants to go. It's not knowledge. It's not information. It's not an ideology. It's not a philosophy. It's not a morality. It's not a religion. No, it's a relationship with Christ. And he wants to know Christ. See, in the same way that I might say, I want to know Fiona, my wife. I do know Fiona. I've been married to Fiona now for nearly 37 years, but I want to know Fiona. I want to understand her more. I want to get to know how she ticks more and more. And the more I get to know, the more I should want to get to know. And so it is with God. And so what does Paul say? Well, he says, I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. I think we can relate to the first words, can't we? That is, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. I mean, who doesn't? Who doesn't want to know the reality of being raised with Christ in the future and the power of that now? The power that raised Jesus from the dead to be at work in us. Wow. I mean, to know that God is at work in us with the same dramatic impact as he was on that first day of the week when he raised Jesus from death in the tomb to life again. Who wouldn't want to know the power of the resurrection? But this next bit, well, not quite so sure. Because he says there, and participation or fellowship with or sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. I mean, doesn't he know about the suffering of Jesus? Of course he does. He knows it deeply and he wants to know it more. He wants to be intimately connected with Jesus, not only in his resurrection, but in his sufferings and becoming like him in his death. See, Jesus calls us to follow him, to take up our cross and deny ourselves, to die to ourselves that we might live to Christ. Paul wants to know the sufferings of Jesus in himself. He wants to suffer for Christ. He wants to live his life, to pour out his life for Christ, and so to become like him in his death. And what does that mean? Well, if we've been reading through Philippians, and I hope you've been joining me in that journey, back in chapter 2, he tells us what that looks like. See, for Jesus, who being in very nature God, didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He makes himself nothing. He takes the nature of a servant, becomes like him, being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man. He humbles himself and becomes obedient to death, even death on a cross. So I take it to become like Jesus in his death, to become like Jesus in his sufferings, is to give up ourselves for the sake of others. See, there's an intimacy with Christ as we become like him in pouring out ourselves as an offering for other people, giving ourselves to them that they might be saved, loving people, being committed to those around about us, putting others before ourselves, serving people, ministering to people, caring for people. This is what it's like to share in the sufferings of Christ, to become like him in his death. And sometimes that will be really hard. Sometimes there will be genuine opposition. There will be real threats. There will be suffering. There will be persecution. It will be difficult. It will be hard to continue. And Paul prays that he might. So yes, resurrection and suffering and death. But I wonder whether you picked up on this, because it almost seems like he's got it round the wrong way. Because surely you talk first of all about suffering and death and then resurrection. I mean, that's what it was for Jesus, wasn't it? He went to Jerusalem where he was rejected by the leaders. He was tortured. He was executed. And then he was resurrected on the third day. And surely we live this life, there's suffering in this life, and we look forward in the future to resurrection. But what Paul's saying here, and this is the wonder of this, is resurrection first, suffering next. How does that work? Well, I think it works like this. That is, the power that raised Jesus from the dead is at work within us. As we put our trust in Jesus Christ, so we receive the Spirit of God, and God will be at work in us so that we are able to push on through suffering, so that we can endure even to the point of death, so that we can become more and more like Christ, selflessly giving ourselves to others. See, what is the power of God? What is his resurrection power? I take it it's to transform selfish, sinful, self-motivated, self-entitled people into the lovers of others, the servants of those around about us. That is a powerful act of God. That's a miracle of God. And Paul wants to know that at work within himself. Of course, one day, then to attain to the resurrection, where he is free from suffering and free from pain. Doesn't know how that's going to happen, whether he's likely to die soon or whether he might even be alive when Christ returns. But that will happen. Now, friends, I want to ask you, as I really reflect on this myself, to be honest, have you prayed a prayer like that for yourself? Will you pray a prayer like that for yourself? Will I? Will I pray that I might know God's resurrection power so that I will be willing and able to become more and more like Christ in his suffering, in his selfless service of others, and become like him in his death, giving myself for the sake of others that they might be saved? Because, friends, there is the experience of God. There's a knowledge of God. There's a sharing together with Christ. There's the understanding of the power of the Spirit at work within us. If you want to know God, if you want an intimate experience of God, if you want to know the power of God, then pray that God will help you to serve as Jesus served, to give your life for the sake of others. And there you will see God's power at work in you. Let's pray this prayer. Father, help me through the power of your resurrection to give my life for the service of Jesus and the salvation of others. Amen.